Now we are going to discuss the mediation theory by Charles Osgood. Charles Osgood is a very famous American psychologist who worked on developing the mediation theory in 1953 and yes, in 1957 as well, and claims that the linguistic stimulus, a word or sentence, elicits a mediating response that is self-stimulating. Osgood is known for his studies in the area of measuring the connotative meaning which is attached to language. Now, according to him, a word or a sentence elicits a mediating response. That mediation or that mediating response needs to be looked at. This mediation or mediating response is self-generating, self-stimulating, and this self-stimulation he refers to as representational mediation process, something that goes internally to analyze the input and then produce a certain behavior or certain response to that. So the idea is not to simply look at the stimulus and response, but also what happens internally before a person produces a certain response. That particular process is what he calls representational mediation process. Mediation process is viewed as covert and invisible, acting within the learner. Now, this process is not visible. This process is hidden, or it is very much internal, and it goes within the learner. This process takes place within a learner, and that makes it quite a rational and cognitive theory as well. Though it is considered as a behaviorist theory, but this particular aspect, which is mediation, makes it a rational and cognitive theory as well. Learning is a process of developing new internal or external behavioral associations. Now, it is about how the internal input and the external approach are both associated. This association process is responsible for the establishment of meaning. So, there is a meaning which is formed based on the association of internal as well as external behavior. The key elements of the theory are: number one, physical stimulus. The physical stimulus refers to body usually reacts to, which means that whenever we hear something or we touch or smell, it basically causes certain physical reaction. Second is internal response. After physical stimulus, the individual begins to internalize what the physical stimulus is, and then he or she takes it to internal stimulus. Now that internal response becomes internal stimulus, which actually leads to internal stimulus through the understanding of that response, which is the thought in which you relate the stimulus to. This happens when, after reacting to physical stimulus, you relate that information to some past information that you already have in your mind, and you internalize it. Therefore, your internal response becomes your internal stimulus, based on which you perform or you generate outward response. Now that outward response is physical or quite visible response that takes place due to the first response. So these are the 3 to 4 key elements of the theory which constitute the very mechanism of mediation process. Osgood proposed 3 levels in his mediation theory. Number 1 is sensational level. Number 2, perception level. And number 3 is representational level. Sensational level refers to basic stimulus response action occurrence. Now in this level, the occurrence of the basic stimulus response happens. And then you have the perception level where input occurs and then you relate it to the past experience and you come up with your own judgment and perception. Representational level is a level where all that process takes place and generate outward reaction, which is overt behavioral response to the word or any stimulus that you come across. This image from the mediation theory shows the representational process where you see the stimulus leading to a response where this block S and R are the stimulus and response. This refers to the representational process. From stimulus to response, what happens here is the mediation process where he says that although individual can respond overtly to actual environmental stimuli, they also have a representation of the stimulus and response that is internal in the organism. While the symbol S and R are used to represent the overt stimulus response, this R and this S basically show the internal representation. So meanings occur here in the internal S and R. Now this model is considered to be highly complex model, but that is how Osgood represented the very process of the mediation theory. To conclude, mediation theory refers to how meanings are learned and how they relate to internal and external behavior. The process takes into account the sensational, perceptual, and representational levels of understanding learning behavior.